Welcome to our first animation lecture for the Good Life class. I'm Dr. Michael Brady, and before we start, I wanted to say something about my approach to this class and my own bias when I look at the topic of the good life. First, and most important, I'm a philosopher by inclination and by training. So my approach is quite different than a literature, history, or anthropology professor. But I'm also a pluralist. I strongly believe that there are many good ways to approach a question about the good life, and I do not think for a second that my way is the only way. Finally, I am a pragmatist, and this means that as a philosopher, I am always experimenting with ways to make our lives better through a balance of ideas and action. As long as we humans have been recording our ideas on stone, clay, or paper, we have held up the great men as examples and models. And when I say great men, I do mean to stress that they have almost always been men. Whatever my personal views about this vast imbalance, this is a fact, one we'll return to near the end of the animation. But we will begin by looking at one of the oldest recorded tales, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a story of what we might today call an anti-hero, and his transformation over the space of the tale. But one thing is for certain, he is a man of action, a man who acts first and usually acts with violence. Our second great man will be Socrates, the philosopher. He is the very model of a man of reason, and nearly all of Western thought owes something to his initial foray into philosophy. All of us are born into a culture, and Gilgamesh was no different. According to the epic itself, and some other near-contemporary sources, he was likely a real king of a Sumerian city-state called Uruk. The city was founded around 5000 BC, so around 7,000 years ago. So yeah, pretty old. These images can give us some idea of the scale of his kingdom. We can see ancient temple sites from the city, and at the bottom is a recreation of a castle based on some local archaeology. At the time, Uruk was on the shore of the historically important Euphrates River. There are some differing opinions, but it's likely the city was quite large for the time and held somewhere between 30,000 and 90,000 residents. Even a casual search of the history of this city, of Gilgamesh, and of the region will often mention just how old and influential it all is. Sometimes, depending on the source, it will even be described as part of a revolution in farming, mathematics, and centralized governments. Philosopher Mike, that's me, worries that we should be careful reading history as leading cleanly into views we are so comfortable with today. For example, there's a much earlier archaeological site in present-day Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. It's around 4,000 years older than Uruk. That would place it around 12,000 years ago. Very, very old now. And it seems to be structured quite differently than Uruk was. It is hard to peer back in time, of course, but some researchers think that this site lasted for 1,500 years without any large-scale farming, and according to researchers shows no signs of centralized government that we see in other places like Uruk. I bring this up because as we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, that's it right there in clay, we should not assume that the first recorded story is the only story from that time. History is full of chance. Places with dry climates that wrote on clay tablets are much more likely to last thousands of years, while wet coastal areas that built in wood, wrote on plant-based papers, or only used oral transmission would never be found, much less 7,000 years later. But that does not mean that my ancient Celtic ancestors, or your ancestors, wherever they may have lived in the world, did not have their own equally heroic tales. The Epic of Gilgamesh is an amazing story, and in many ways we still value the same types of stories today. Almost every single action film or even video game has similar themes that we'll see when reading through this book. So when you begin your reading about Gilgamesh and start asking yourself what you think about it, keep some of this history and background in mind. Is a hero tale universal, Are there any drawbacks to a hero tale? Is it perhaps human nature to value men of action? Or maybe did we learn this value through the stories and cultures that somehow survived, while others did not? As influential as the heroic tale of Gilgamesh might be, the man of reason is its equal in importance. Our day-to-day life and our culture sometimes becomes so ingrained that it seems almost impossible to imagine any alternative. But in our modern world, all of us are living in economic, political, and social systems that are sometimes only 200 or 300 years old. All you need to do is look at the reading list of almost any college class. Are you a business or finance major? Well, Adam Smith, who in his own day called himself a moral philosopher, largely created capitalism as we know it. And today, almost the entire world runs on an economic system created in the mid-1700s. Are you a political science or international relations major? Then you probably know that John Locke and Karl Marx created much of the political structure we live in today. The ideas behind our economics, politics, and cultures have become so normal to us that we sometimes forget that initially they were created in some thinker's mind. As a famous example, one of the earliest and most influential men of reason was Socrates. The interactive method of question and answer that you so often see between professor and student very closely resembles the way that Socrates behaved in ancient Greece with his own students. And like Gilgamesh, Socrates emerged from a famous cultural and historical moment. Athens was a very wealthy maritime trading city, and much like Uruk, there were temples and public buildings everywhere. The temple to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, still dominates the hill above the city, and many statues and other monuments are there as well. The agora, or public market and meeting place, where Socrates met to discuss philosophy with his students, is right there on the bottom of the page. But the culture of Athens was very different than that of the Sumerians and Gilgamesh. For a good portion of its history, Athens was a functioning democracy, though we should carefully note that it was a very limited democracy. Of the roughly 200,000 residents, 30 to 40,000 were voting citizens. The rest of the population were non-citizen residents, workers, and many slaves. And of course, this much larger group had little to no say in the government. Still, the idea that a democracy could be an option was part of the history passed on by Athens. Amazingly, Socrates never wrote anything down that we know of. But the dialogues of Plato, that's him right there, made Socrates famous as a person who lived and died, spoiler alert, like literally died, because of his belief in reason. Socrates often called himself the gadfly of Athens. He believed it was his duty to his own city to ask difficult questions of powerful people. He often pressured and prodded these same powerful people. And maybe even worse, he trained as many young students to also challenge what their elders said. It's an amazing story of a different type of hero. Now, Plato is not our only source about Socrates. He's also mentioned in plays, most famously by Aristophanes, and also by several others. Surprisingly, considering it was more than 2,000 years ago, they're all quite similar in their description of his character. When you read the ideas of Socrates, I hope you will again keep some of this history and context in mind. It really is impossible to exaggerate how influential Socrates, through Plato, has been on the formation of the Western academic mind that we're all living in at this college right now. This is a class about the good life and not a history class. But I've explained some of this background so that you can decide for yourself whether great men should have mattered as much as they did. More importantly, I hope you will pause and ask whether they should matter as much as they still do today. The answer may very well be a loud yes, but even if it is a yes, I hope you'll still pause and think before you answer. Now, I really do have one of the most fun jobs of all time. Just like Socrates, part of my duty as a professor is to push you a little bit, to ask uncomfortable questions and bring up problems. This does not mean that I'm right and it definitely does not mean that you have to agree with me. But let me give you some of my ideas on this topic, and you can see what you think. First, I'd like to confess that I've always loved books like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Really, any story of physical conflict, fighting against the odds, working to overcome difficult issues of any kind work on me. Even a very questionable hero like Gilgamesh will often keep me reading. At the same time, I also worry about the outsized influence of great men, simply because it's almost always men, literally like a bunch of guys. Now, Gilgamesh is famously a man of action, and there are thousands of heroic action tales in pretty much every culture in the world. In some countries, you might find a few exceptions to this men-only rule, like Tomoe Gozen in Japan, or the wonderful Celtic queen Boudica during Roman times. But the imbalance, especially historically, often worries me. My argument about the men of reason is similar to what I've just said about the great men of action. I've dedicated much of my life to reading philosophy. It would be no exaggeration to say I've read hundreds and hundreds of philosophy books. And even the ones I do not really agree with, I often still find kind of interesting. And the real truth is that many of these books have changed my life for the better. But if you ever do take a history of philosophy class, you'll see for yourself that almost every single famous philosopher was a man. When I gave you some examples earlier, we saw a small example of this. Adam Smith, John Locke, Karl Marx, all men. It turns out that there were always quite a few philosopher queens, as one of my favorite recent books shows, but their influence was always quite small. It was never the quality of their work. When you go back and read their philosophy, it's equally good, sometimes even better than their famous male colleagues. But they never really had much influence. And when I see this type of unfair imbalance, it makes me wonder whether my own hero worship of male philosophers was part of the problem. So what do you think?